Sheriff Jake Thompson was just settling into his armchair, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and the TV remote in the other, when the loud knocking at his front door shattered his peaceful morning. He wasn't expecting guests, especially not the kind who pounded loudly like they were trying to force entry. With a deep sigh, he set his coffee mug down and walked to the entrance. The sight that met him nearly made him laugh out loud. 3 men in ill-fitting uniforms stood on his porch, their chests pushed out like they were about to raid a hideout. The tallest one, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and reflective sunglasses, took a step forward, flashing a shiny badge that looked more like it came from a toy shop than an official department. "Sir," the mustached man said in a deep, commanding voice, "we need you to come outside immediately." Jake lifted an eyebrow, crossing his arms firmly over his chest. "And who might you be?" "We're with the AORI enforcement unit," the man declared, his 2 followers nodding seriously behind him. "You've broken multiple neighborhood rules, and we're here to take you in." Jake stared at them for a long moment, trying to figure out if they were joking or just clueless. "The HOA has an enforcement unit now?" he asked, playing along. "We do," the mustached man said, lifting his head. "And we don't allow violations." The ridiculousness of the situation was almost too much. Jake knew his HOA had always been a little strict, but this was next-level nonsense. The mustached man reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded notice, dramatically flipping it open. "You have been cited for an unapproved mailbox," he announced, his voice full of fake authority. "An unauthorized lawn furniture." Jake blinked slowly. "My mailbox?" He glanced over at the standard black mailbox, standing at the end of his driveway. "What's wrong with it?" "It doesn't match the HOA's latest design rules," one of the followers added, reading aloud from his clipboard. "Section 4, subsection B, line 12. And my lawn chairs?" Jake continued, pointing to his porch, where 2 simple wooden chairs sat untouched. The mustached man hesitated, checking his notes, then looked back up at Jake. "It's not allowed." Jake fought back a grin. "So let me get this straight. You're trying to arrest me for a mailbox and porch chairs?" "This isn't a joke," the mustached man snapped, stepping forward. "Breaking HOA rules is a serious offense. You're coming with us." Jake folded his arms. "And where exactly are you planning to take me?" The man squared his stance. "To our detention facility." At that, Jake couldn't hold back his laughter. "You mean to tell me the HOA has a jail?" The mustached man's face turned bright red. "It's not a jail. It's a compliance center." Jake took a deep breath, rubbing his chin. "I see," he muttered, pretending to think it over. "Well, gentlemen, I hate to disappoint you, but I'm a bit occupied today, so I'll have to decline your offer." The mustached man's patience snapped. "That's it," he barked. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Jake didn't move. "Or what?" One of the followers stepped forward, pulling out a cheap pair of handcuffs that looked flimsy, as if they'd break easily. "Do it now, sir, or we'll be forced to act." Jake sighed, shaking his head. "All right." He turned slightly, reaching down to his side, not for a weapon, but for the small radio clipped to his belt. With a quick press, he sent out a silent alert to his deputies, all without breaking eye contact with the so-called officers. The mustached man grinned, clearly thinking he had won. "That's right," he said smugly. "You're learning your place." Jake held back another laugh. "Oh, I know my place." As soon as the followers stepped forward to lock the weak cuffs on him, Jake moved swiftly. In one motion, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and spun him toward the nearest car. The man yelped as his face slammed against the hood. The mustached man staggered back. "Hey, what the heck do you think you're doing?" Jake glanced at him, still holding the struggling man in place. "Performing a citizen's arrest." The second follower reached for something on his belt, probably a fake fine book or another phony document, but he froze as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Within seconds, real police vehicles screeched to a halt, their lights flashing. The HOA officers looked like scared deer caught in headlights. Jake leaned in closer to the man he had pinned. "Now, let's talk about who's really under arrest." The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the houses as 2 police cars came to a halt in Jake's driveway. The mustached man, and his two assistants looked like they had just been caught breaking into a bank. Their confidence vanished the moment Deputy Carter stepped out of his vehicle, one hand resting on his duty belt. Carter took in the scene, Jake still holding one of the fake officers pinned against the hood of a car, while the other two stood frozen in place. He raised an eyebrow. "Boss, you mind explaining why you're wrestling with a guy wearing what looks like a costume cop outfit?" Jake finally let the struggling man go, stepping back and brushing off his hands. These three gentlemen were in the process of making an illegal arrest. Figured I'd save them the trouble of doing it the hard way. Carter let out a low whistle, turning to the trio. "All right, let's see some IDs." The mustache man tried to regain control, straightening his cheap polyester uniform. "There's been a misunderstanding. We are certified HOA enforcement officers, and we were carrying out our jobs." Carter stared at him for a moment, then slowly reached out and plucked the badge from his chest. He turned it over in his hand, examining the poorly engraved letters that read ACHY, Compliance Officer. He looked back up at Jake. "This is a joke, right?" Jake smirked. "I wish it was." The mustached man puffed out his chest again. "We have full legal rights to issue violations and enforce HOA rules." Carter remained unimpressed. "Yeah, and which department issued these fancy badges?" The man hesitated, then cleared his throat. "The Homeowners Association Security Division." Carter snorted. "That's not a real thing." The second assistant, still rubbing his wrist from Jake's takedown, jumped in. "It is. We were given authority over all properties in this community." Carter tilted his head slightly. "Authority? Is that so?" He turned to Jake. "Boss, did you sign off on this?" Jake grinned. "Nope." Carter gave the mustached man a long stare. "Well, then, I guess you're just some guys running around pretending to be police officers." The mustached man's face darkened. "You don't understand. We were only enforcing the rules. We have every right to detain those who break HOA laws." Jake stepped closer, his voice turning icy. "Detain? You were trying to handcuff me over a mailbox." The mustached man hesitated, clearly realizing how ridiculous it sounded. "Well, technically," Jake's voice hardened. "There's no technically about it. You try to cuff me, that's impersonating an officer, and depending on how you plan to restrain me, we could be talking about illegal detention or worse." Carter folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "So let's start with some real names and authentic identification." The three men hesitated before reluctantly handing over their wallets. Carter flipped through them, then showed Jake. "You're going to love this. Not a single one of them is a licensed security officer. They don't even have basic clearance." Jake exhaled deeply. "You telling me they're not even certified?" Carter shook his head. "Nope, just some random guys in cheap uniforms playing law enforcers." The mustached man shifted nervously. "Look, we were just following instructions." Jake narrowed his gaze. "Whose instructions?" The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. "The HOA board." Jake crossed his arms. "Got any official paperwork to prove that?" The second assistant quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled document, handing it over. Carter took one glance and laughed. "This isn't a contract. It's a volunteer patrol form." Jake shook his head, sighing. "So let me get this straight. You three assumed that meant you could pretend to be officers, harassing homeowners?" The mustached man's lips pressed into a thin line. "It wasn't harassment. It was community oversight." Jake gave him a cold stare. "How much were you charging residents for these violations?" The assistants exchanged nervous looks but remained silent. Jake breathed slowly. "Deputy, let's search their vehicle." Carter nodded and walked toward the HOA-branded SUV parked by the curb. He opened the door, rummaging through the contents. A few seconds later, he let out a low whistle. Well. We got citation books, fine notices, and would you look at that, a cash box." Jake turned back to the mustache man. "You running an HOA or a roadside fraud operation?" The man swallowed hard. "We were just collecting payments." Jake shook his head. "No, what you were doing was illegal." The second assistant blurted out. "We were told to do it. The board promised us a percentage." Jake exchanged a glance with Carter. "Now we're getting somewhere." Carter flipped through a ledger he had found in the SUV. They've been charging homeowners, issuing fake warnings, and even threatening property seizures. Jake let out a slow sigh. And people actually paid them? Carter nodded. Looks like it. Jake turned back to the three men. Here's what's going to happen. You're all being detained while we investigate this scheme. If you're lucky, you'll just be facing fraud charges. If we find out you threatened or forced payments, it's going to get much worse. The mustache man tried to argue you can't arrest us for enforcing community guidelines. But Jake gave him a dry stare. Carter stepped forward, pulling out a set of handcuffs. All right, gentlemen, turn around. The mustached man opened his mouth to object, but when Carter raised an eyebrow, he slowly complied. The two assistants followed, both looking utterly defeated as Carter secured their wrists and started reading them their rights. Jake turned to look at the small crowd of neighbors gathered to watch. Some were whispering, others shaking their heads. An older woman near the front of the group called out, "Sheriff, does this mean we can ignore those fines they've been forcing on us?" Jake gave her a reassuring nod. "If they ever took money from you, keep your receipts. The county prosecutor will want to see them." A murmur spread through the crowd, and more people stepped forward, each with their own story about how the fake HOA officers had harassed them. Jake looked over at Carter. "We need to have a conversation with the HOA board." Carter grinned. "Oh, I can't wait for this." By the time Jake and his team arrived at the HOA office, word had already spread. The board members were waiting nervously, their faces tense, but determined to act confident. The HOA president, a thin man in a suit too large, stood at the front, his hands clasped together in what he probably assumed was a dignified stance. "Sheriff," the man said, forcing a smile, "this is all a misunderstanding." Jay crossed his arms. "A misunderstanding? You mean the part where your fake officers tried to arrest me, or the part where they were running a money collection scam?" The president cleared his throat. "We were simply trying to keep order in the community. There have been complaints." Jake cocked his head. "Complaints about what exactly?" The president hesitated, then gestured vaguely. "Non-compliance." Jake smirked. "You mean mailboxes and lawn chairs?" A woman with silver hair, another board member, spoke up. "Sheriff, we have to uphold neighborhood rules. People buy homes here expecting a certain level of order." Jake studied her face. "And does that order include hiring unqualified men to threaten homeowners?" The silver-haired woman stiffened. "They were simply volunteers." Jake pulled out the fake citation book from the so-called HOA officers. Volunteers who were charging residents, issuing bogus tickets, and pocketing cash. That's not volunteering. That's theft. The board members shifted uneasily. The president tried to smooth things over. "Look, maybe we went too far, but surely we can settle this privately. There's no need to involve law enforcement." Jake let out a low chuckle. "Too late for that. Your guys are already in cuffs, and we've got plenty of proof." The president's smile faltered. "Surely, there's a way to resolve this peacefully." Jake took a step forward. "You want a fair deal? Start by returning every dollar these men took from residents. Then we'll talk about what's next." The silver-haired woman scoffed. "This is outrageous. The HOA has functioned this way for years." Jake gave her a hard stare. "Yeah, well, that ends now." By the time Jake left the HOA office, the board members looked like they had just received a death sentence. He knew they weren't getting away with this scam, not if he had any say in it. Back in the neighborhood, the scene had turned into a block party. People were gathered outside, sharing stories about their experiences with the fake officers. Some were laughing, others were furious. An older man in a golf cap approached Jake. "Sheriff, I was fined $200 last month for excessive decorations." He gestured toward his yard, which had nothing more than a bird feeder and a small garden gnome. A young woman stepped up next. "They charged me $300 for parking overnight in my own driveway." Another neighbor groaned. "I had to pay $500 because my grass was slightly too tall, and they threatened to double it if I didn't cut it in 24 hours. Jake shook his head. "You all are getting your money back one way or another." The crowd erupted in cheers. Someone even popped open a drink and handed it to Jake, who accepted it with a grin. Deputy Carter wandered over, looking amused. "This might be the first time I've seen a sheriff's case turn into a community festival." Jake took a sip. People love seeing justice served. Carter smirked. Well, you're about to enjoy this. Just got word from the prosecutor's office. They're looking into major fraud, charges against the entire HOA board. Jake raised an eyebrow. Now that's music to my ears. Carter held up a file. Oh, and it gets even better. We checked the HOA's financial records. Guess who's been skimming money off the top? Jake leaned in. Don't tell me. Carter grinned. Your buddy in the cheap suit the HOA president has been stealing thousands. And guess where a chunk of that money was going? Right into the pockets of those fake cops. Jake let out a low whistle. Well, looks like we're making another set of arrests. It didn't take long. Within minutes. The HOA leader and his partners were being placed into squad cars, looking just as stunned as the fake officers had been. The community members gathered to observe the arrests, some even cheering as the handcuffs locked into position. Jake leaned against his vehicle, watching the final criminal get secured inside. The elderly gentleman in the golf hat strolled back up. Sheriff, have you ever thought about running for office? Jake chuckled loudly. I think I'll stay with law work. The man smirked. Well, if you change your decision, you've got my backing. Jake just nodded slightly, smiling. Let's just restore this neighborhood back to peaceful times.